was about 8th or ninth grade when I first started to become aware of fashion in my own life. I think before 8th or ninth grade, I didn't really care about what I looked like or what I wore or, any of that stuff. And I guess that's normal. Like 8th or ninth grade, you sort of become more self-aware of what you're looking like. Anyway, it was about 8th or ninth grade for me that I started, noticing like brands and clothes and colors and what I wanted to wear and what I did not want to wear. So I got interested in a couple of like brands of clothes and logos that I wanted printed or embroidered on my clothes, things that I thought were cool. And I found out where to buy those clothes. Mostly they were department stores, if you remember, like Weinstocks. Yeah. Robinson's May. Yeah, some of these stores. Pacific Sunwear was one of those kind of up-and-coming surf shops. Different stores like that, some other retail stores. And that's where I found that the clothes that I sort of wanted to wear could be purchased. The only problem with that was that they were expensive. And that did not go so well with my family because we were a frugal family. I mean, we weren't penny pinchers, my parents weren't super penny pinching, but they were definitely frugal. Like, you don't buy what you don't need, and you don't pay more than you have to pay for things. You can buy clothes that are a lot cheaper than those clothes, so don't buy those clothes. So, this created a tension. Mom to the rescue in this moment. My mom sort of made it her mission to get me some of the clothes that I wanted, but at prices that she wanted. So there were a number of times when I would come home from school and I remember laying on my bed or laying on the chair would be like these clothes. And they had the logo, or it had like the imprinting, or it had like the size or the color, and the thing that I really wanted. And I'm looking at it going, thank you, this is great. Upon further inspection, I noticed that the clothes didn't have the right kind of tag on them, like they were bought from Weinstocks or Robinson or somewhere else. My mom loved thrift stores. And so she would get together with her friends, and they would descend on the best thrift stores to find the good deals of cool clothes. And they loved doing this. It was like a treasure hunt for them to try to find these things in the store. So here's me, and I've got to reconcile, am I okay with this? I love the clothes, but I realize, these are somebody else's clothes. And as a 13-year-old, I had to figure out, is that okay? My mom was ahead of her time, I feel like. She was the first repurposer of clothes. And because repurposing right now is the rage. We repurpose everything. We repurpose, kitchen utensils. We repurpose things in our yard. We repurpose stuff that's broken and needs to be fixed. We use reusable water bottles because we don't want to throw away and recycle things. I mean, we want to repurpose everything. At the heart of repurposing, what does repurposing mean? It's to give a new purpose. I mean, it's give a new and purpose. It's simple. Give a new purpose to something, like something that has lived its life, and now we're ready for another life. Let's give it this new way, this new purpose, this new life. God creates us with purpose. I mean, we have goals to seek. We have things to attain to, we have missions to be on. God creates us with purpose. And those give us vitality. Those give us energy. Those give us fulfillment. Work is good. Missions to have are good things for us. And so God gives us those projects to help us understand God and be able to serve God's world and do things with the gifts God gives us. And those are good things. The problem, though, for all of us that are normal people, is that purpose tends to come and go. Sometimes, we all know purpose is really strong, and we're so excited about doing this thing, accomplishing this task, helping this person, doing this job, finishing this work. and we get purpose through it. And then other times, we can lose the sense of purpose. It often happens, when a job is done, or a project is finished, or a change is happening, or something that was is not there anymore. We have those lost senses of purpose. So what happens, and where is God in those seasons where the sense of purpose isn't there as much? Check out this verse. Familiar verse, but in light of God in those times where our purpose isn't quite as vibrant. Check out this verse. We are God's workmanship. God has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the things He planned for us long ago. We often talk about, the Bible talks about all the time, that God is creator of heaven and earth. God is creator. That's back then. God is creator. But this verse talks about God not being creator, but God creating anew. This is God repurposing our lives. This is the brand new purpose that God can give us, because even when the old purpose or that temporary purpose or that other purpose is done, God's ready to create with a new purpose. So how does that work? How can God create us with new purposes? Thanks be to Ezekiel. We are almost done with Ezekiel. I promise we are almost done with Ezekiel. If you feel like this summer has been the trudge through Ezekiel, I understand and I'm with you. Ezekiel is not the most popular book in the world. In fact, it's probably the least popular book in the entire Bible. But we have done it. So in another week, after next Sunday, you can say, our church read through and studied the book of Ezekiel and we came out alive afterward. It's a challenge. But at the same time, there's some super cool things in the book of Ezekiel, especially now that we're on the last quarter of the book, where God's got this sense of hope coming through Ezekiel. These new things are happening, including God doing new things among His people, creating them anew, repurposing them, doing some amazing things. There is one story in Ezekiel. If you told somebody, hey, I'm reading through the book of Ezekiel, they're like, I know one story from the book of Ezekiel. The one about the bones. The dry bones. The valley of the dry bones. That's the story for today. Which brings up the question, why bones? I mean, of all the things that could point to in this latter part of the book, the positive, the renewing, the repurposing things that God can do, bones. I mean, why bones? It's actually because of the people. See, these people that we've been following through the entire book, these people who were God's people, are God's people who had sort of fallen out of favor with God. They were living the way God wanted. They were exiled so that God could discipline them and teach them and bring them back. Then God promises to bring them back. These people, through this entire exile, this tough season of their lives that we've been walking with them through, they have not felt well. The way they describe themselves is that they're just hurting and they're pained and they're suffering. In all these dramatic ways, they've described how they are not well. Which makes sense. They're far away from home, they're far away from everything that's good and familiar in their lives, they're far away from the things that are helpful to them and cause them to grow and help them to be healthy. So many things are taken away. But most importantly, especially for Ezekiel, is that they're taken away from their sense of faith. Because they were taken away from their homeland, that's sort of where God lived. They are exiled, they're living over here, they were stolen away, and they're like, I'm far away from my faith. They're physically far away, but they're also spiritually far away. And it's creating this mess in them that they feel like they're far away from their faith. So in this season where they're just not feeling well on all sorts of levels, they develop this saying. They said it enough, and they said it long enough, that it became something that everybody just started to say. And we find it later in the chapter, but it's this saying. The people started to say, we have become old, dry bones. It was their metaphor for themselves and how they felt. We just feel like old, dry bones. We're tired, we feel dead in our faith, we feel dead in our sense of purpose, we feel dead on all sorts of levels, like old, dry bones. So because the people said that, because that's how the people felt, that's where God meets them. And that's where God starts this whole lesson on what God's going to do in them. So, in light of that, let's get into the story. The Lord took hold of me, says Ezekiel, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then he asked me, Son of man, can these bones become living people again? O sovereign Lord, I replied, you alone know the answer to that. We'll pause there. Remember, God goes here because the people are starting with bones. To the people, bones were super important. It wasn't like us eating a rack of ribs and we gnaw the meat off the bones and we throw them in the trash. Their sense of bones was that these bones are so important. When somebody passed away in their world, they would treat the body with respect, just like we do, but they did something a little different with their bodies. Where did they bury their bodies? Whereas we tend to bury in the ground in coffins, or we make ashes and put them in places. Where did they bury their bodies? In tombs. We see that in the Old Testament. All these families had tombs or little caves. Jesus was buried in a tomb. That was sort of the practice. They buried in tombs. Their tombs, you go in and they often had shelves in them. Places where they would lay various bodies of their families. They did that because they wanted to preserve the bodies and they were waiting for something to happen. So when somebody passed away, they would go in, they would lay a body on a shelf, they would seal up the tomb, and then the tomb would be sealed up until the next person in the family or the group passed away, and they would have to open up the tomb again. When they went in and placed the next body on another shelf, they would observe the previous one. How's the body? Sorry, I know this is kind of gross, but some of you are like, so the next one, they would go in and they would notice, is this body decomposed? Like, is the tissue worn off? Or is it just a pile of bones? And eventually it would be. And what they would do with the pile of bones is they would take the bones, which are no longer a skeleton, it's just bones, they would put them in a box. Usually right in the middle of the tomb, they would put them in a bone box. We've heard about these in the news over the years. A new bone box is discovered in Israel or Palestine or somewhere, and they call them ossuaries. And these are these little boxes that they would put their bones in. What's the big deal about the bones? Why are you putting two reasons, primarily, why they would put the bones in the box? We find references to things like this throughout the Bible, but one of the reasons that they would put the bones in the box is because they saw that the bones are the thing that lasts. That our tissue, our muscle, our ligaments, or everything, it kind of just decomposes and wastes away, but the bones don't. The bones are sort of what's left after everything else goes away. And to them, that was sort of their sense of who they are. Who am I? It's down to my bones. We often talk about that. I'm chilled down to my bones. There's some Bible passages that refer to this also. And my bones are shaking with terror. I mean, a sense of to my core, it's my bones that are the core of who I am. You can see other things. And even in Genesis, the creation story, this at last is bone of my bones. This is connected to who I am. So they connected bones to the fundamental sense of their identity, who I am as a person. The other thing that they saw and they connected with this bones is that they believed that life lasted longer. They wanted to keep their bones because they believed that that's where eternity and life forever started. So they said once we pass away, we become just bones, but they believed that resurrection wasn't just a spiritual thing that happened with souls. They believed in bodily, physical resurrection. Like you and I become, in some way or another, bodily resurrected. Now, without going into total bodily resurrection and dynamics of physical eternity and all that, there are some verses that allude to this, and this is where they get this. There's some other verses. But your dead will live. Their bodies will rise again, says Isaiah. God will redeem them from the grave. He will surely take them to himself. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake someday. They're talking about, there's a connection here. Just like when Jesus was raised from the dead. It wasn't just spiritual. They saw his body. And they believed there's something connected to our bones in eternity. So this is important stuff. So God starts with the bones to teach Ezekiel and the people about bones because they believe that this is not all there is to life. For as much as we invest in this life, and it's good to, and God calls us to, and God gives us purpose and missions and projects and great work to do, this is not all there is. So just to clarify, we're all going to be in this situation someday. Trust me, we will. Me too. This is not all there is. There's so much more. And God says, I am creating you for a new purpose. Not only now, but forever. So Ezekiel, trust that I am with you and can carry you through anything and repurpose you into that new season, whether it's today or for eternity. So, back to Ezekiel. What does God ask Ezekiel? He asks him that awesome question. Do you believe that these bones can become alive or can become living people again? Now, imagine that you were asked that question by God. What are you going to say? I mean, you can't say no. That wouldn't work so well. But if you say yes, then you feel like you've got to be able to explain how. So what does Ezekiel do? He totally ducks the question. It's great. He says, oh God, only you know the answer to that question, because I have no clue what the answer to that question is. In this, he's saying, God, you have the ability, you have the power, you have the understanding when I don't. So here's the next section. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am going to put breath into you and make you live again. I will put flesh and muscles on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I, Ezekiel, spoke this message, just as he told me. Suddenly, as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then, as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones. Then skin formed to cover their bodies, but they still had no breath in them. What an absolutely frightening moment. Oh, really? God says, say this. Ezekiel says it, and it's like, bam! These bones come back together and start moving and rattling and shaking. I mean, I'm going to be freaked out. This is he's experiencing this. He's seeing it. He's in the middle of it. It's like the ultimate 4D movie, right there in front of him. But did you notice, when did it happen? When Ezekiel started to speak, it happened immediately. This was not one of those like predictive prophecies about 50 years in the future, in your further generations, when you're long gone, something will happen. This is like in the moment, this thing happens. Who made it happen? Obviously God. We have to say God made it happen, but Ezekiel was not an observer. He was not just sitting there in his chair watching God do all this miraculous work across this valley. He was the speaker. He was the proclaimer. He was the announcer. He was right in the middle of it. God wants us to fully invest in this life. The things that God is doing, the miracles God can do, the strength that God can show, the power that God can exhibit, God invites us to be fully in the middle of what God is doing. For all the eternity and the forever that's out there that God talks about, God says, I want you here right now. What we often talk about stepping into faith, stepping into relationship with Jesus, stepping into mission, stepping into projects, stepping into all sorts of things. That's like now. I'm taking steps now. And God's saying, I want you fully in this life right now. I'm inviting you to participate right now. Ezekiel's not done. There's something else that happens, because did we notice how we left off? Then skin formed to cover their bodies, but they still had no breath in them. These bodies aren't alive yet. It's like that story back in the Gospels when Jesus is supposed to restore sight to the blind man, and he puts mud on his eyes and he says, hey, can you see? And he's kind of like, sort of. It's all fuzzy. So he does it again, and then all of a sudden he can see. It's like for some reason, it's this two stages of God's forming these bodies, but what's next? What's lacking? What's missing? Check out this last section. Then God said to Ezekiel, speak a prophetic message to the winds, son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath, from the four winds, breathe into these dead bodies so they may live again. So I spoke the message as he commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet, a great army. Now these bodies have totally new life. It's awesome. So what happened? How did it happen? The wild part about this passage, the whole passage, is in this section, 10 times is this word for wind, spirit, or breath. Nobody knows how to translate it. Nobody knows which one's which. If you open up a different version, if you go home and find 10 different versions, they all have different translations of these words. Wind, spirit, or breath, or breath, spirit, wind, or wind, spirit, breath. And they have no idea which one is which, because it's the same word. It's the word for spirit, God's spirit. And God's spirit is breath, is wind, is the thing hovering over the waters. It's God's spirit. So when these bodies need to be raised, what is being breathed into them? Well, it's like wind, spirit, breath that's being brought into these bodies. What is it that brings life to us when we need life? It's God's Spirit. And it's only God's Spirit. And it's the most popular word in this whole passage by far. It's like flooding the passage so that it floods our minds to say, oh, there is nobody else who can give me life except God's Spirit. Life, new life, repurposed life. Just when they felt like their purpose was missing or purpose was gone, God stepped in and repurposed their lives. In the same way, when our purpose seems to be lacking, God can step in and repurpose our lives. Here's a few questions. A few questions to think about, talk about, whatever we'd like to do. What do I need God to repurpose in my life? How can I become more trusting that God can repurpose anything? And here's the one I think about more. Am I ready to ask God to repurpose this?